On the 8th of May, 1945, the guns finally fell silent across Europe. General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma stood in the ruins of what had once been the Third Reich's Eastern Command, watching American soldiers advance through the shattered streets of a small Bavarian town. The general, a decorated panzer commander who had fought across 2 continents, now faced an entirely unexpected chapter of his military career: imprisonment in the land of his enemies. Von Thoma was not alone in his predicament. Across the collapsing front lines, thousands of German officers found themselves surrendering to Allied forces, their once mighty Wehrmacht reduced to exhausted, depleted units. Among these captured commanders were men whose names had struck fear across battlefields: General der Panzertruppe Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, General der Infanterie Mauritz von Victorin, and Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein. These were not common soldiers, but members of the military elite, men who had planned operations involving millions of troops and coordinated movements across entire continents. The American military police processed them with surprising efficiency. Von Thoma noticed immediately that his captors maintained a professional demeanor, lacking the vengeful brutality he had been led to expect by Nazi propaganda. The Reich's Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda under Joseph Goebbels had spent years telling Germans that capture by Western forces would mean torture and summary execution. Standing in that processing line, von Thoma realized the first of many lies he had been told. Within 48 hours of his capture, von Thoma found himself aboard a transport vessel bound for America. The ship, a converted Liberty ship named the USS General W.P. Richardson, carried over 3,000 German prisoners across the Atlantic. The journey took 11 days, during which the general had time to contemplate his new reality. He had fought in the Spanish Civil War, commanded tanks in North Africa under Erwin Rommel, and witnessed the catastrophic defeat at El Alamein. Yet nothing in his extensive military experience had prepared him for what awaited on American soil. According to documentation preserved in the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, Maryland, the United States established over 500 prisoner-of-war camps during World War II, holding approximately 375,000 German POWs at the conflict's peak. These facilities ranged from small branch camps attached to military installations to massive compounds capable of housing tens of thousands of prisoners. The War Department, operating under the guidelines of the Geneva Convention of 1929, had created an unprecedented infrastructure to manage this enormous captive population. As von Thoma's ship approached New York Harbor on the 23rd of May, 1945, he stood on deck with other high-ranking officers, watching the Statue of Liberty emerge from the morning mist. The symbolism was not lost on him. Here stood the monument to freedom, welcoming men who had fought to destroy the very ideals it represented. General von Schweppenberg, standing beside him, muttered something about the irony of their situation, but von Thoma remained silent, his mind racing with questions about what came next. The generals were separated from lower-ranking prisoners immediately upon landing. Special protocols existed for high-value captives, particularly those with significant intelligence value or command experience. Von Thoma and approximately 30 other senior officers were transported by train to Camp Clinton in Mississippi, a facility specifically designated for general officers and other high-ranking personnel. The train journey from New York to Mississippi took 3 full days, passing through a landscape that defied every expectation the German generals had formed about America. General Fritz Bayerlein, who had served as chief of staff to Rommel and commanded the Panzerlehr Division, pressed his face against the window, marveling at the endless expanse of undamaged countryside. Cities stood intact. Factories operated at full capacity, and civilians went about their business as though the world were not still burning on the other side of 2 oceans. "Look at this," Bayerlein said to von Victorin, pointing at farms that stretched beyond the horizon. No bomb craters, no destroyed villages. They fought a global war without a single battle on their territory. The realization of America's industrial and geographical advantages settled heavily upon the captured officers. They had fought for a nation constantly under siege, while their enemies had transformed their homeland into an untouchable arsenal of democracy. Camp Clinton materialized before them on the morning of the 26th of May, 1945. as something entirely unexpected. The facility sprawled across several hundred acres of Mississippi pine forest, surrounded by standard security fencing and guard towers. But beyond these martial necessities, the camp resembled nothing so much as a small, orderly town. Neat rows of barracks painted in regulation olive drab stood in precise formation. Paved roads connected different sections of the compound. Areas designated for recreation, education, and even gardening occupied substantial portions of the grounds. Colonel James Harrison, the camp commandant, met the arriving generals personally. A West Point graduate who spoke passable German, Harrison explained the camp regulations with military precision. "Gentlemen," he said, his words translated by a bilingual sergeant, "you are prisoners of war, but you are also officers. The United States Army expects you to maintain military discipline and decorum. In return, we will treat you in accordance with international law and military courtesy." The generals were escorted to their barracks, and here the first genuine shock occurred. General von Thoma stopped at the threshold of the building assigned to him, staring at the interior with undisguised amazement. The structure contained individual rooms rather than open bay sleeping arrangements. Each room, designed for 2 occupants, featured actual beds with mattresses, not straw pallets on wooden frames. Small desks and chairs furnished each space. Windows fitted with screens allowed ventilation while keeping insects out. But the feature that caused the most profound reaction stood at the end of the barracks hallway. A communal bathroom facility, unlike anything these men had encountered in military service. General Lieutenant Hans Kramer, who had also served in North Africa and endured the primitive conditions of desert warfare, walked slowly into the tiled room, examining each fixture with the fascination of an archaeologist discovering ancient treasure. Multiple toilets lined one wall, each in its own partitioned stall with a door that closed and locked from the inside. These were not the crude field latrines or even the basic facilities they had known in Wehrmacht installations. These were modern, American-style flush toilets with comfortable seats and adequate paper supplies. Adjacent to the toilets stood a row of sinks, each with both hot and cold running water. Above the sinks hung mirrors, and dispensers provided soap. The shower facilities occupied a separate section of the bathroom. Multiple shower heads protruded from the walls, each capable of delivering hot water at sufficient pressure. Kramer turned a handle experimentally, and hot water immediately flowed from the fixture. He stood watching the steam rise, remembering the cold water field showers of his military career, the days without any bathing facilities at all during campaigns, the constant struggle with lice and disease that plagued frontline troops. According to research documented in the book Hitler's Last Army, German POWs in America, by historian Edward Pluth, the emphasis on sanitation in American military facilities reflected both practical health concerns and cultural priorities. The United States Army had learned harsh lessons about disease and hygiene during previous conflicts, particularly World War I, when more soldiers died from illness than combat. By World War II, the American military had institutionalized rigorous standards for sanitation, standards that applied even to prisoner facilities. General von Schweppenberg approached the bathroom facilities with the critical eye of a professional soldier. He had commanded the 5th Panzer Army and possessed intimate knowledge of military logistics and infrastructure. "This represents more than simple prisoner accommodation," he observed to von Thoma. "This demonstrates industrial capacity. They have plumbing infrastructure, water treatment, sewage systems, manufacturing capability for fixtures and supplies. All of this while fighting wars on multiple continents." The first week at Camp Clinton forced the German generals to confront a series of assumptions they had held about American society and military capability. On the 3rd day of their internment, the camp administration organized a medical inspection for all new arrivals. The clinic facilities provided another revelation about American standards and priorities. Dr. Robert Kleinman, a U.S. Army medical officer of German Jewish heritage, conducted the examinations with professional detachment. The irony of his background was not lost on the German officers, though Kleinman himself never mentioned it directly. The medical facility contained equipment that many German field hospitals would have envied: X-ray machines, dental chairs, examination tables, and cabinets stocked with pharmaceuticals and medical supplies. General Bayerlein, who had been wounded multiple times during his military career, underwent a thorough examination of an old shoulder injury. "Your rotator cuff shows significant damage," Dr. Kleinman explained through a translator. "We can provide physical therapy if you're interested. It won't restore full function, but it should reduce your pain." The offer of medical treatment beyond basic necessities surprised Bayerlein. In the Wehrmacht, wounded officers often received minimal follow-up care once they returned to duty or were invalided out of service. The dental services proved even more remarkable. General von Victorine, suffering from several broken teeth sustained during the chaotic final weeks of the war, received not just extractions, but actual restorative work. An army dentist filled cavities, created temporary bridges, and treated infections. "We maintain dental health for all prisoners," the dentist explained. "Disease prevention is cheaper than disease treatment, and oral health affects overall physical condition." Information compiled by the International Committee of the Red Cross, which regularly inspected POW camps throughout the war, documented the exceptional hygiene and medical standards in American facilities. Reports from 1944 and 1945 consistently noted that German prisoners in American camps received medical care equal to or exceeding that provided to American military personnel in similar circumstances. This stood in stark contrast to conditions in German POW camps, particularly those in Eastern Europe, where Soviet prisoners died by the hundreds of thousands from neglect, starvation, and deliberate maltreatment. The daily routine at Camp Clinton further emphasized the disconnect between Nazi propaganda and American reality. Prisoners woke at 6 o'clock each morning to the sound of a bugle, not unlike their Wehrmacht experience. But the similarities largely ended there. After morning roll call, prisoners proceeded to the mess hall for breakfast, and the meals themselves provided another source of wonder. The camp kitchen served food in quantities that shocked men who had spent the final year of the war on increasingly meager rations. Breakfast typically included eggs, bread, butter, coffee, and often meat. The U.S. Army allocated approximately 4,000 calories per day for POW diets, recognizing that adequate nutrition served multiple purposes. It maintained prisoner health, reduced healthcare costs, prevented disease outbreaks, and demonstrated American abundance to men indoctrinated with propaganda about Western weakness. General Kramer, sitting with his breakfast tray on the fourth morning of his internment, looked at the scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee before him, and shook his head slowly. "I've eaten better this week as a prisoner in America than I did during the last 6 months commanding troops in Africa," he said quietly. The other officers at his table nodded in agreement. Several had lost significant weight during the war's final months, when German logistics collapsed and even general officers sometimes went hungry. The camp maintained strict cleanliness standards that required prisoner participation. Each barracks had an assigned cleaning detail that rotated weekly. Prisoners were expected to keep their living quarters neat, their belongings organized, and common areas clean. The bathrooms received particular attention, with daily cleaning and regular inspections by American NCOs, who demonstrated no tolerance for substandard conditions. Initially, some German officers bristled at what they perceived as menial labor beneath their rank. General von Schweppenberg objected to Colonel Harrison about being required to participate in bathroom cleaning duties. "I commanded 50,000 men," he protested. "I'm being asked to scrub toilets?" Harrison's response proved instructive about American attitudes. "General, I commanded 20,000 men at various points in my career. When I was a lieutenant, I cleaned latrines. When I was a captain, I inspected latrines. As a colonel running this camp, I ensure that latrines are maintained to standard. Rank carries privilege, but it also carries responsibility. These facilities serve you and your fellow prisoners. Maintaining them demonstrates personal discipline and respect for your living conditions. Or would you prefer to live in filth?" On the 12th of June, 1945, an incident occurred that crystallized the cultural differences between German military tradition and American practicality. The camp administration scheduled mandatory showers twice weekly for all prisoners, a frequency that seemed excessive to men accustomed to far less frequent bathing opportunities. General Ritter von Thoma, raised in the Prussian military tradition, where hardship and discomfort were considered character building, initially viewed the shower requirement as evidence of American softness. "They treat us like children who need supervision for basic hygiene," he complained to General Major Ernst Schaefer, a staff officer who had served in the Wehrmacht High Command. "In Russia, we went weeks without proper bathing facilities. It made us harder, more resilient. These Americans with their obsession about cleanliness and comfort. This is weakness." Schaefer, a more pragmatic officer who had managed logistics for Army Group Center, disagreed. "No, Herr General, this is intelligence. Consider what we saw in Russia. How many men we lost to disease, to infections, to conditions that had nothing to do with enemy action. How many soldiers became casualties because of lice-borne typhus? How many died from infected wounds that proper hygiene might have prevented? The Americans understand something we dismissed. Healthy soldiers fight better than sick ones, and hygiene is preventive medicine." The debate became moot when an outbreak of skin infections affected several prisoners who had arrived from another camp with existing health problems. Dr. Kleinman responded by implementing additional hygiene protocols and conducting educational sessions about disease prevention. He requisitioned a blackboard and gave lectures explaining germ theory, bacterial transmission, and the relationship between cleanliness and health. Many of the German officers found these lectures elementary, but the practical demonstrations proved illuminating. Kleinman showed microscope slides of bacteria cultures taken from unwashed hands, comparing them to cultures from properly washed hands. He explained how contaminated water spread dysentery, how poor hygiene contributed to respiratory infections, and how simple preventive measures dramatically reduced disease rates. "The U.S. military learned these lessons the hard way," Kleinman explained, according to his recorded recollections preserved in the U.S. Army Medical Department archives. During the Spanish-American War at the turn of the century, disease killed more soldiers than combat. In the training camps during World War I, influenza and other diseases devastated units. By this war, we had institutionalized hygiene standards that save lives. This isn't luxury, it's tactical necessity. The shower facilities themselves became a daily reminder of American industrial capacity. Unlike the cold water field showers or rare hot water opportunities the Germans had known, Camp Clinton's system delivered consistent hot water to multiple shower heads simultaneously. The camp's boiler system, maintained by American engineers with prisoner assistance, heated water for the entire facility. Pressure regulators ensured adequate flow, and maintenance crews addressed any problems within hours. General Kramer, whose Africa Corps experience had included months of strict water rationing in the desert, found himself lingering in the shower, marveling at the simple abundance of hot water flowing at will. In North Africa, men had bathed with canteen water, if they bathed at all. Sometimes they had gone weeks without washing properly, conserving every drop of water for drinking and cooking. Here, hot water flowed freely, apparently limitless. The psychological impact of these conditions gradually affected the German officers in ways they had not anticipated. Clean bodies, clean clothes, regular meals, and adequate sleep began to restore men who had spent years under enormous stress. The chronic exhaustion that military command imposed slowly lifted. Officers who had appeared aged beyond their years began to look healthier, more alert, more like their pre-war selves. Colonel Harrison observed these changes and understood their significance. In conversations with his own staff, recorded in his personal papers now housed at the U.S. Military History Institute, Harrison noted that well-treated prisoners caused fewer disciplinary problems, cooperated more readily with camp administration, and proved more willing to provide intelligence information during interrogations. The humane treatment served multiple purposes, combining genuine humanitarian concern with practical camp management benefits. The German generals began to reassess not just their living conditions, but their entire understanding of American society. Brigadier General George Drake, the intelligence officer responsible for interrogating high-value prisoners, visited Camp Clinton regularly throughout the summer of 1945. His conversations with captured German commanders provided insights that would shape post-war understanding of the Wehrmacht and Nazi Germany. During one session, Drake asked von Thoma about German perceptions of American military capability before the war. "We believed you were soft," von Thoma admitted. "Rich, comfortable, undisciplined. We thought your army was a social club, your soldiers weekend warriors playing at military service. This was what we were told, what our intelligence services reported, what our political leaders claimed." Throughout July and August of 1945, the interrogation sessions at Camp Clinton revealed the depth of German miscalculation about American society and military potential. General von Schweppenberg, whose Panzer Group West had faced American forces in Normandy, sat across from Brigadier General Drake in a Spartan but comfortable interrogation room, reflecting on the intelligence failures that had contributed to German defeat. "We underestimated everything about America," von Schweppenberg said, speaking in fluent English he had rarely used during the war. "Your industrial capacity, your logistical systems, your ability to project power across oceans, even your common soldiers' initiative and adaptability. But most fundamentally, we misunderstood what motivated your society. We were told Americans valued comfort over honor, wealth over duty, individual pleasure over collective sacrifice. We saw these values as weaknesses." Drake, a career intelligence officer who had studied in Germany before the war, leaned back in his chair. "And now? What's your assessment after living in this camp for 3 months?" The question was genuine, not rhetorical. The U.S. Army's intelligence services were compiling comprehensive reports on German military thinking, trying to understand how the Wehrmacht had reached such catastrophically wrong conclusions about Allied capabilities. Von Schweppenberg gestured toward the window, through which the camp compound was visible. Prisoners walking freely within the fenced perimeter, playing volleyball, reading in the shade, maintaining the meticulous order that American standards required. "I see now that your comfort and your discipline are not contradictory. You provide hot showers not because you are soft, but because you understand that clean soldiers are healthy soldiers. You feed prisoners well, not from weakness, but from the strength of having so much abundance that generosity costs you nothing. You maintain these facilities to these standards because you have the industrial and organizational capacity to do so without effort." The general paused, gathering his thoughts. "We in Germany prided ourselves on our hardness, our willingness to endure privation, our Spartan military tradition. We saw suffering as purifying, hardship as character building. But I have watched men in this camp recover health they had lost, regain mental clarity they had sacrificed to exhaustion, become more themselves rather than less. Perhaps there is wisdom in not requiring unnecessary suffering." Documentation from the National Archives indicates that these interrogation sessions produced intelligence of enormous value. The German generals, removed from the propaganda machine that had shaped their public statements during the war, spoke with increasing candor about Wehrmacht operations, strategic decisions, and the internal dynamics of Nazi leadership. The comfortable conditions at Camp Clinton contributed to their willingness to cooperate. Men who were well treated and respected even in captivity proved more forthcoming than those subjected to harsh conditions. General Bayerlein provided particularly detailed information about German defensive preparations in Normandy, explaining how the Wehrmacht had completely misjudged the scale and sophistication of Allied planning. "We knew you were coming," he told his interrogators, "but we thought you would come at Calais where the crossing was shortest. When you came at Normandy, we thought it was a feint. Even after the landings, our high command believed the main invasion would come elsewhere. This was intelligence failure on a catastrophic scale." The generals also discussed the internal dynamics of Nazi Germany's military leadership, revealing the dysfunction and competing power structures that had hampered German military effectiveness. Von Thoma, who had been captured in North Africa as early as November 1942 and had spent most of the war as a POW in British and American custody, provided perspective on how German strategy had evolved throughout the conflict. Hitler's interference in military operations became increasingly erratic after Stalingrad, von Thoma explained during one session. He refused to authorize tactical retreats, even when they were militarily necessary. He believed willpower could overcome material disadvantage. He lived in a fantasy world where German superiority was assumed rather than demonstrated, And we, the professional military officers, allowed this to happen. Some believed his vision. Others knew better but lacked the courage to challenge him. We are all complicit in the disaster that followed. These confessions carried psychological weight for men raised in the Prussian military tradition, where honor, duty, and obedience formed the foundation of officer identity. The comfortable surroundings of Camp Clinton, paradoxically, made such difficult self-examinations possible. Men who were not fighting for daily survival had the mental space to reflect on larger questions of responsibility and failure. The camp's educational facilities supported this process of reflection and reassessment. The American administration established a library stocked with books, newspapers, and magazines, including German-language publications printed in the United States. For the first time, the German officers had access to uncensored information about the war, including details of Nazi atrocities that had been hidden from the German public or dismissed as enemy propaganda. General Kramer spent hours in the library, reading accounts of concentration camps, mass executions, and systematic genocide. According to later interviews preserved in oral history collections, this exposure to information about Holocaust atrocities profoundly affected many of the Wehrmacht officers. Some insisted they had known nothing of these crimes. Others admitted they had heard rumors but had dismissed them as impossible or exaggerated. All struggled with the implications for their own service and their nation's future. The camp administration did not force these confrontations with uncomfortable truths, but neither did they hide information. Colonel Harrison believed that educated prisoners who understood the full scope of Nazi crimes would return to Germany better prepared to participate in building a democratic future. This assumption reflected broader American policy toward post-war Germany, though its implementation in POW camps preceded formal occupation governance. By September of 1945, Camp Clinton had established a routine that gave structure and purpose to the daily lives of its prisoners. The German generals, initially uncertain how to occupy themselves in captivity, gradually adapted to a regimented schedule that balanced required duties, educational opportunities, and recreational activities. The normalcy of this routine contrasted sharply with the chaos and uncertainty they had experienced during the war's final months. Morning began at 6 o'clock sharp with reveille, a bugle call that reminded the prisoners of their military identity even in captivity. After roll call and inspection, prisoners proceeded to breakfast in the mess hall, where the consistent quality and quantity of food continued to impress men who had endured severe shortages during the war's end. The mess hall itself embodied American approaches to institutional management, efficient, clean, organized, according to principles of industrial flow and sanitation. After breakfast, prisoners reported to assigned work details. Under the Geneva Convention, officer prisoners could not be compelled to work, but the camp administration encouraged voluntary participation in tasks that maintained the facility and provided productive occupation. Some generals worked in the library, cataloging books and maintaining the collection. Others assisted in the administrative offices, helping with translation work or organizing records. Still others tended the extensive gardens that supplemented the camp's food supply. These gardens became a source of particular pride for many prisoners. General von Victorin, whose family had owned agricultural estates in East Prussia before the war, oversaw a section that produced vegetables with remarkable efficiency. He organized other prisoners into work details that prepared soil, planted seeds, maintained irrigation, and harvested crops. The American administration provided seeds, tools, and guidance, and the prisoners applied German organizational skills to maximize production. It gives purpose, von Victorin explained to a visiting Red Cross inspector in late September. A man needs to feel useful, to see the results of his labor. These tomatoes, these beans, these potatoes, they feed us, yes, but more importantly, they demonstrate that we retain our competence, our ability to accomplish tasks and achieve results. This matters psychologically more than physically. The Red Cross inspector, a Swiss national named Heinrich Müller, who filed regular reports on camp conditions per the Geneva Convention requirements, noted the exceptional state of Camp Clinton in his documentation. His reports, preserved in International Committee of the Red Cross Archives in Geneva, Switzerland, consistently rated the facility among the best-maintained POW camps in the United States. Miller specifically commented on the hygiene standards, medical care, food quality, and recreational opportunities available to prisoners. Afternoons offered educational programs that many prisoners embraced eagerly. The camp established classrooms where prisoners could study English, mathematics, history, engineering, and various other subjects. American instructors, often drawn from nearby universities or retired teachers volunteering their time, taught courses that prepared prisoners for eventual return to civilian life. Some German officers, recognizing that their military careers had ended permanently, began contemplating post-war futures in a defeated Germany. General Major Schaefer enrolled in an accounting course, reasoning that post-war Germany would need administrators capable of managing reconstruction efforts. "The Germany we return to will not need generals," he observed to fellow prisoners. "It will need builders, organizers, educators, administrators. We must prepare ourselves for different forms of service." This practical attitude reflected growing acceptance among the prisoners that their world had fundamentally changed. The recreational facilities at Camp Clinton rivaled those at many American military installations. Sports equipment included soccer balls, volleyballs, and even baseball equipment, though most Germans found baseball baffling and stuck with familiar European sports. The camp had a theater where prisoners organized performances, including musical concerts and dramatic productions. Some prisoners formed a choir that performed classical German compositions, finding in music a connection to cultural identity that captivity had not severed. Perhaps most remarkably, the camp allowed prisoners to maintain correspondence with family members, subject to censorship for security purposes. Letters moved slowly across the Atlantic, delayed by damaged transportation infrastructure in Europe and the chaos of post-war displacement. But gradually messages reached prisoners from wives, children, parents, and siblings, providing information about loved ones' survival, or, in tragic cases, confirmation of deaths. As autumn deepened in Mississippi, the German generals engaged in increasingly frank discussions about the comparative standards they had experienced across different captivity situations. Several officers had been prisoners of British forces before transfer to American custody, and a few had brief experiences with Soviet imprisonment before capture by Western allies. These comparative perspectives illuminated the stark differences between Allied and Axis treatment of POWs. General Kramer, who had been captured by British forces at Tel El Akakir in North Africa during November of 1942, described his experiences in British camps with measured appreciation. "The British treated us correctly according to military conventions. The camps were adequate, food sufficient if not abundant, medical care professional. But resources were constrained by Britain's circumstances. They were fighting for survival, enduring bombing, rationing everything. They treated us as well as they could afford." By contrast, American abundance made generosity relatively effortless. Camp Clinton received supplies with regularity that reflected America's intact infrastructure and massive production capacity. When equipment broke, replacements arrived quickly. When supplies ran low, new shipments appeared. The American military supply system, which had sustained operations across 2 oceans and multiple continents, maintained POW camps with the same logistical efficiency. This abundance had political implications that the more perceptive German officers recognized. General Lieutenant Dietrich von Koltitz, who arrived at Camp Clinton in late September after transfer from another facility, brought perspectives shaped by his experiences as military governor of Paris. Von Koltitz had famously disobeyed Hitler's orders to destroy Paris before retreating, a decision that saved countless lives and priceless cultural treasures, but branded him a traitor in Nazi Germany. "America fights differently than we understood," von Koltitz reflected during evening discussions with other generals. "We conceived of war as total struggle, requiring total commitment of all resources and all people. America fights industrially, systematically, with excess capacity. They produce so much that they can afford to treat prisoners generously while simultaneously sustaining massive military operations. This is not weakness. This is strength so overwhelming that they need not hoard or ration or sacrifice unnecessarily," The contrast with German treatment of prisoners haunted increasingly candid conversations among the captive officers. They knew, though many had not witnessed directly, that German POW camps had operated under radically different principles. Soviet prisoners in German custody had died by the millions through deliberate starvation, exposure, disease, overwork, and outright murder. Western Allied prisoners had fared better, but still endured harsh conditions, minimal rations, and inadequate medical care. According to historical research documented in Behind Barbed Wire German POW Camps in America by historian Arnold Kramer, approximately 95% of American and British POWs held by Germany survived captivity, while Soviet POW survival rates approached 57%. In contrast, over 99% of German POWs held by American forces survived, a statistic reflecting both American resources and American values. General Bayerlein, struggling with these moral reckonings, engaged in a lengthy conversation with camp chaplain Major Robert Wilson, a Methodist minister from Tennessee serving as a U.S. Army chaplain. Wilson, who spoke German after studying theology at Heidelberg before the war, provided spiritual counsel to prisoners wrestling with guilt, shame, and uncertainty about their futures. "I commanded men who committed atrocities," Bayerlein confessed during one session. "Not systematic genocide. My units were combat formations, not SS, but reprisals against civilians, harsh treatment of prisoners, destruction beyond military necessity. I told myself these were wartime necessities, that our enemies did the same, that this was simply what war required. But living here, seeing how you treat us with such consideration despite everything we did, I question all those rationalizations." Wilson, according to his memoir published decades later, did not offer easy absolution. "You will carry this the rest of your life," he told Bayerlein. "The question is what you do with that burden. You can let it crush you, or you can let it motivate you to build something better. Germany will need leaders who understand what went wrong and commit to different paths. Perhaps your suffering can serve a purpose if it informs better choices." December of 1945 brought cold weather to Mississippi, though nothing approaching the brutal winters the German generals had endured on the Eastern Front. The camp administration responded by providing additional blankets, winterizing barracks with improved heating, and adjusting work schedules to minimize outdoor exposure during the coldest hours. These considerations, small in themselves, accumulated into a broader pattern that continued to reshape prisoner perspectives. The Christmas season proved particularly significant. Colonel Harrison authorized prisoners to organize holiday celebrations, including traditional German Christmas observances. The prisoners decorated common areas with handmade ornaments, organized carol singing, and prepared special meals with ingredients provided by the camp administration. For men separated from families and uncertain about loved ones' circumstances, these traditions provided emotional anchoring during a difficult time. On Christmas Eve, the prisoners held a candlelight service in the camp chapel, a simple wooden building that served multiple religious denominations. Major Wilson conducted a bilingual service that included German hymns and readings. General von Thoma, raised in a deeply Lutheran tradition, found himself moved by the familiar rituals performed in this unexpected setting. After the service, he approached Wilson with questions that went beyond religious formalities. "Why do you treat us this way?" von Thoma asked bluntly. "You have every right to hate us, to want revenge for what our nation did. Your country lost hundreds of thousands of men defeating us. Many of you had friends or relatives killed by German forces. Yet you feed us well, house us comfortably, provide medical care and education and dignity. Why?" Wilson considered the question carefully before responding. "Because we believe in principles that transcend individual circumstances. The Geneva Convention establishes rules for prisoner treatment, and we follow those rules not when it's convenient, but especially when it's difficult. Because we believe that human dignity is not something you earn through good behavior. It's inherent in being human. Because we want to demonstrate through actions, not just words, what kind of society we are building and what kind of world we hope to create." The chaplain paused, then added, "And because we understand that you will return to Germany eventually. When you do, you will remember how you were treated. If we had treated you cruelly, you would carry bitterness and desire for revenge. But if you carry memories of justice and dignity, perhaps you will help build a Germany that operates according to similar principles. Your treatment here is partly about you, but it is also about Germany's future. This conversation, which von Thoma later described in post-war interviews preserved at the German Historical Institute, crystallized insights that had been forming gradually during months of captivity. The American approach to prisoner treatment reflected long-term strategic thinking, not just immediate humanitarian concerns. By treating German prisoners well, America was investing in post-war reconciliation and reconstruction. Throughout January and February of 1946, news from Germany painted an increasingly clear picture of the total devastation the nation had suffered. Letters reaching Camp Clinton described destroyed cities, collapsed infrastructure, severe food shortages, millions of displaced persons, and the chaos of occupation administration. The contrast between prisoners' relative comfort in Mississippi and their families' suffering in Germany created complex emotional responses. Some prisoners felt guilt about their adequate circumstances while loved ones endured privation. General von Schweppenberg wrote long letters to his wife in occupied Germany, describing his health improvement and adequate conditions while struggling to find words that would not seem boastful or insensitive to her hardships. The censors who reviewed his letters noted his careful attempts to balance truthfulness about his situation with sensitivity to his wife's circumstances. The camp administration addressed these psychological tensions by expanding educational programs focused on Germany's future reconstruction. Visiting lecturers, including German expatriates who had fled Nazi persecution, and American experts on European affairs, spoke about plans for rebuilding German society on democratic foundations. The prisoners learned about the emerging occupation policies, the denazification programs, and the ambitious plans for economic recovery. By spring of 1946, the pace of prisoner repatriation accelerated as Allied authorities began organizing the massive logistical operation required to return millions of displaced persons to their home countries. Camp Clinton received notification that high-ranking German officers would be among the last groups repatriated, as their intelligence value and potential security concerns required additional processing and evaluation. The generals used this extended time to prepare practically and psychologically for return to a defeated Germany. General Bayerlein organized discussion groups where officers studied materials about democratic governance, constitutional structures, and civilian administration. We were trained to command, to give orders, to impose discipline through military hierarchy, he explained to fellow prisoners. These skills will be useless, or even harmful, in the Germany we return to. We must learn to persuade rather than command, to cooperate rather than dominate, to serve rather than rule. The practical skills classes proved particularly valuable. Officers who had spent entire careers in military service now studied civilian trades and professions. Some took courses in construction management, recognizing that rebuilding German cities would require enormous organizational efforts. Others studied teaching methods, understanding that education would be critical for generational change. Still others focused on business administration, preparing for roles in whatever economic system emerged from the ruins. General Kramer, reflecting on his impending return during an interview with an American military historian in April 1946, expressed profound ambivalence about leaving Camp Clinton. "This has been the strangest period of my life," he said, his weathered face showing the complex emotions that words struggled to capture. "I came here as a defeated enemy, expecting harsh treatment or at best cold correctness. Instead, I found conditions that challenged every assumption I held about America, about military necessity, about what civilization means even during wartime. Part of me is eager to return home, to reunite with my family, to contribute to rebuilding. But another part of me fears leaving this ordered, clean, adequate world for the chaos and devastation waiting in Germany." The camp's bathroom facilities, which had seemed so remarkable upon arrival, now represented something more profound in prisoners' understanding. These were not merely toilets and showers, but physical manifestations of a society's values and capabilities. General von Victorine, preparing to depart in May of 1946, stood in the barracks bathroom one final time, examining the fixtures he had used daily for nearly a year. "I will tell people about this," he said to General Major Schaefer, who was packing his few belongings nearby. "When they ask what American captivity was like, I will describe these bathrooms, not because bathrooms are important in themselves, but because they represent everything we underestimated about America. The industrial capacity to manufacture such fixtures in wartime, the infrastructure to supply hot water consistently, the organizational discipline to maintain standards even for prisoners, the values that make such considerations priorities rather than luxuries. We lost the war in factories and fields as much as on battlefields, and these bathrooms prove it." The repatriation process began in earnest during the summer of 1946. Prisoners were processed through a series of administrative steps: final medical examinations, documentation verification, intelligence debriefings, and political evaluations. American authorities conducted extensive interviews to assess each prisoner's Nazi Party involvement, war crimes allegations, and potential security risks. Most of the generals at Camp Clinton, as professional military officers rather than political ideologues, passed these evaluations without difficulty. On the 15th of July, 1946, General von Thoma boarded a transport ship in New Orleans for the return journey across the Atlantic. The voyage took 12 days, carrying thousands of German POWs from camps across the American South. The conditions aboard ship were austere compared to Camp Clinton, but adequate. Von Thoma spent much of the journey standing at the rail, watching the ocean and contemplating the transformed world he was returning to. The ship docked at Bremerhaven on the 27th of July, 1946, and the returning prisoners received their first direct exposure to Germany's condition. The port city lay largely in ruins, its infrastructure shattered by years of Allied bombing. Hungry civilians crowded the docks hoping for food or opportunities. Military police from multiple Allied nations maintained order amid the chaos of occupation. Von Thoma walked down the gangplank into this devastation, feeling as though he had traveled not just across an ocean but across a chasm separating two incomprehensibly different worlds. According to documentation preserved in the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, Germany, the returning POWs from American captivity often experienced severe adjustment difficulties upon repatriation. Men who had lived in clean, orderly camps with adequate food and medical care now confronted destroyed cities, severe shortages, family tragedies, and a society struggling with trauma and defeat. The psychological transition proved as challenging as the physical circumstances. Von Thoma made his way to what remained of his family's estate in Bavaria, traveling by train through devastated landscapes where destroyed bridges had been temporarily replaced by military engineering, where forests had been stripped for firewood, where every city showed scars of bombing and artillery. When he finally reached his destination in early August, he found his wife and daughter living in 3 rooms of a house mostly destroyed by American artillery during the final weeks of the war. The reunion, joyful despite the circumstances, brought the contrast between his captivity experience and his family's wartime suffering into sharp focus. His wife had endured years of aerial bombardment, food shortages that left her 30 pounds lighter than when he had last seen her, the loss of their home and most possessions, and the constant fear and uncertainty of the Nazi state's final collapse. Listening to her experiences, von Thoma struggled with guilt about his relatively comfortable imprisonment. The subsequent months proved extraordinarily difficult for the returning prisoners. Germany in late 1946 existed in a state of suspended catastrophe, with occupation authorities struggling to prevent starvation, restore basic services, and establish functioning governance. The currency was nearly worthless, food remained severely rationed, housing shortages forced multiple families to share damaged buildings, and the psychological trauma of defeat permeated society. Yet many of the returning generals found purpose in applying lessons learned during captivity to reconstruction efforts. General Bayerlin, settling in the American occupation zone, became involved in establishing local governance structures. He advocated for sanitation systems, water treatment facilities, and public health programs, explicitly citing what he had observed at Camp Clinton as models for what civilian infrastructure should provide. During a town meeting in his community in October of 1946, Bayerlein spoke about his experiences to civilians skeptical about cooperation with occupation authorities. "I was a prisoner of the Americans for over a year," he explained. "They maintained standards of cleanliness and order even for their enemies. They provided hot water for showers, proper sanitation facilities, medical care, adequate food. These were not luxuries. They were expressions of a society that values human dignity and understands that public health serves everyone. We must build this kind of Germany." The connection between hygiene standards and broader social values became a recurring theme in the post-war reflections of Camp Clinton's former prisoners. General von Schweppenberg, writing his memoirs in the early 1950s, devoted an entire chapter to his imprisonment experience. The book, Gestation, published in 1954, included detailed descriptions of American POW camp conditions and explicit analysis of what these conditions revealed about American society. The modern flush toilets in Camp Clinton were not merely plumbing fixtures, von Schweppenberg wrote in a passage that has been frequently cited by historians. They were symbols of a civilization that had mastered industrial production, that valued sanitation and public health, that could maintain such standards even for enemies during wartime. We German officers, raised in traditions that romanticized hardship and viewed comfort with suspicion, initially interpreted American concern for hygiene as evidence of softness. We were profoundly wrong. The society that could provide hot showers and clean toilets for prisoners, while simultaneously conducting massive military operations on multiple continents, possessed strength beyond anything we had imagined. Historical research conducted in subsequent decades has confirmed many of the German generals' observations about comparative POW treatment standards. According to data compiled by military historians and preserved in various national archives, German POWs in American custody experienced mortality rates below 1%, received caloric intake exceeding Geneva Convention requirements, and had access to medical care that met or exceeded standards for American military personnel. These statistics reflected conscious policy decisions rooted in American values, international law, and practical considerations about post-war reconstruction. The legacy of Camp Clinton and similar facilities extended beyond the individuals who experienced them directly. Returning POWs became vectors for transmitting information about American society, capabilities, and values throughout post-war Germany. Their testimony about conditions in American camps circulated through families, communities, and eventually into broader cultural consciousness. This contributed to West Germany's eventual political and social orientation toward the West during the Cold War period. By the 1960s, several former Camp Clinton prisoners had achieved prominent positions in the Federal Republic of Germany's government, military, and civil society. They maintained that their imprisonment experiences had profoundly influenced their understanding of democratic values, civilian-military relations, and international humanitarian standards. Some corresponded with former American officers from Camp Clinton, developing friendships that transcended their previous enemy status. Colonel Harrison, who retired from the U.S. Army in 1953 and became a college professor, maintained correspondence with several former prisoners until his death in 1978. In letters preserved by his family and later donated to military archives, Harrison reflected on Camp Clinton's broader significance. "We did not change those men's fundamental characters," he wrote in a 1967 letter to von Schweppenberg, "but we demonstrated through consistent action what American values meant in practice. We showed that strength and humanity were not contradictory. We proved that order and dignity could coexist even in the most difficult circumstances. Perhaps this contributed in some small way to building the peaceful democratic Germany that emerged from the ruins." The story of German generals surprised by American hygiene standards ultimately transcended its immediate circumstances to become part of a larger historical narrative about values, civilization, and the conduct of nations even during warfare's extremity. The modern toilets and hot showers that initially seemed so remarkable represented not mere plumbing, but a comprehensive social philosophy about human dignity, public health, and the appropriate conduct of organized societies. In 1985, the 40th anniversary of World War II's end, several surviving former prisoners of Camp Clinton participated in a documentary about POW experiences. General Kramer, then in his 90s, spoke directly to the camera about his imprisonment. "When I first saw those bathroom facilities in Mississippi, I thought the Americans were showing off, demonstrating their wealth and capacity. Only later did I understand that this was simply how they lived, how they believed people should live. They treated us as they treated themselves, with consideration for basic needs and human dignity. This was not propaganda. It was culture. And it was this culture, as much as industrial production or military skill, that won the war." The physical structures of Camp Clinton no longer exist. The facility was decommissioned in late 1946, and the land eventually returned to civilian use. But the lessons learned within those fenced perimeters continue to resonate through military policy, international humanitarian law, and ongoing debates about the proper treatment of detained persons. The German generals who once stood amazed before modern American toilets had encountered in those prosaic fixtures evidence of a society's deepest values made tangible through infrastructure and maintained even under the pressures of global war. Their surprise, skepticism, and eventual understanding traced an arc from ideological certainty through empirical observation to profound reassessment. In bathrooms fitted with hot showers and flush toilets, surrounded by camp infrastructure that maintained first-world standards in wartime, German generals confronted evidence that challenged their assumptions about strength and weakness, civilization and barbarism, victory and defeat. The hygiene standards they found so remarkable proved to be merely one manifestation of deeper principles about human dignity, societal organization, and the proper exercise of power, principles that would shape the post-war world they returned to help rebuild. The legacy of this encounter between German military tradition and American practicality extends into contemporary debates about detention standards, international humanitarian law, and the treatment of enemy combatants. The standards established in camps like Clinton during World War II became precedents informing subsequent conflicts and continuing discussions about balancing security with humanity, even toward enemies in wartime. The flush toilets that surprised German generals in 1945 represented, in their mundane utility, aspirations toward civilization that transcend the temporary circumstances of warfare and speak to permanent questions about what societies owe even to their enemies.